So it's my pleasure to hand over to Simon as our MC for this evening. And he will, as it goes on, tell you about his story and proceed to the introduction of our keynote, Sir Joseph Williams. Simon.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Good evening, everybody, and let me add my welcome to that of Bruce's. Apparently, every night, on average, I speak to around 800,000 people. That's what the numbers say. However, in the studio I sit in, there are only 4 people, and it feels like I'm in a living room. I have an auto cue there, and it is nowhere near as terrifying as speaking to you. This is personal. It's always tougher when it's personal. I can be professional. It is my great pleasure this evening to be here to introduce our keynote speaker, Justice Sir Joe Williams. A mere 4 days since he was knighted by the Governor-General in a formal investiture on his home marae at Manaia near Coromandel town. That is a rare privilege indeed. Only a handful of judges, only a handful of knights and dames. Well, tonight we're going to hear from Justice Sir Joe shortly and hopefully have some time at the end for some questions. Before a chance to not only add to the questions, but maybe some networking and add a little bit of networking on informally. As I age, I've found that my glasses don't work for the close-up stuff. I'm not one of those ones at the menu at the restaurant. I'm the other way around, so I'm going to take them off. You might not recognise me now. No makeup, no glasses. Who is this guy? Watch out, Jacinda, I'm coming. Before I introduce Joe, though, as you've heard, I've been asked to say a few words about my connection to Tauranga Moana. And it's quite simple. Ko Ngāti Pūkenga te iwi. I whakapapa to Ngāti Pūkenga, and I'm incredibly proud of that. I can trace my ancestry to my tūpuna back to Ngāti Pikiao of Te Arawa as well. So Te Arawa and Matatua, I acknowledge you and say, hello, cuz. My journey to discovering my whakapapa, though, has taken more than 20 years. It's been the product of my, I hesitate to say later adult life, my intermediate middle adult life, but it is to me, even more importantly, the journey of my dad. Like so many, he grew up in the mid-20th century, like many of you, a time when we were told New Zealand was a land of equality and opportunity for all. By the 60s, we were fed constant stories of New Zealand having one of the highest living standards in the world, rivaled only by the likes of America in its nascent phase and Switzerland. Supposedly, we were in their league. Supposedly, we were a paradise of prosperity where Māori and Pākehā walked side by side in racial harmony. But for so many working class and Māori in particular, it was all built on a myth and the insidious intergenerational effects of colonialism at play. Te reo Māori was neglected, even actively abandoned, as many Māori adopted the practice of suppressing their language out of fear that it marked them in some way, that it was a handicap to their children getting ahead in the Pākehā world. Everybody seemed to be happy. Speak English, boy, that's the key to your future. But what did it cost? In doing so, identity was lost, and a rootless generation drifted away from their language, away from their marae, away from their cultural practices, joining that urban drift of the time, the burgeoning urban drift, into cultural anonymity and isolation. And Joe will no doubt touch more on this in the duration of his kōrero, but for my dad, it had a far deeper effect, as it did for many. For my dad, it extended to his Māori identity being actively and utterly suppressed. A World War I traumatized father actively banned his wife, my father's mother, from telling her 6 children that they were Māori at all. And despite their suspicion that they actually were, it was only revealed to him almost 50 years after his mother passed. A late night phone call to Talkback Radio revealed a deathbed instruction to find a missing member of a disrupted and disconnected family. And the long journey of discovery and reconnection began. With the help of a number of people, documentary researchers, librarians, Debbie, thank you, I embarked on this journey, and it brought me here to Tauranga, where I explored the native land court records for some hours. I remember with a really bad hangover. I don't want to tell you what happened the night before, because I remember that really well too. It involved John Key, by the way. And some swearing. And after this research, after a few red herrings and mistaken identities, about 10 years ago, I had the privilege of bringing my parents and my children to meet their whānanga as we were welcomed onto our marae Te Whetū o Te Rangi at Welcome Bay. The barber that their mother had taken her boys to across town to see every school holidays. The man who later worked on the wharves with my uncle, and for years later confused my uncle when he'd once said, "It's a wise man boy who knows his grandfather," turned out to be their grandfather. His name was Ernie Te Kepa Pofiufiu Asher. And my father and his siblings never had an opportunity to get to know him. Despite that fundamentally sad historical frustration, my dad, though, was finally returned to the marae and the land of his tūpuna, and it filled him with pride, as it does me. I'm just going to take an aside from my notes here because it connects to the history. Ernie's grandparents were, of their time, a modern love story. Ernie's mother, Katarina Te Atiro, and father, David Asher, lived in Tauranga. At one point, David had the pub, which if I read between the lines, he lost due to gambling debts. But he was also a native land court interpreter. And he spoke fluent reo, and he acted as a bridge. And he was able to do that because of Ernie's grandparents. Ernie's maternal grandmother, Katarina's mother, was Rahira Te Kahuhiapo, a woman of mana and influence in the Western Bay of Plenty. It was said that her rohe, her area of influence extended from Mauao, from the mount, to Te Puke. You could stand, what she could see as she looked east to Te Puke was hers. At the Battle of Gate Pa, when Wahine Māori extended sakua and help to wounded and injured British soldiers, which was a revelation for the time, she was one of them. Ernie's paternal grandfather, David Asher's father, had come to New Zealand as a merchant working for the Nathan family, and he extended down into this way. And while Ernie's grandmother had helped and given aid to wounded British soldiers, Ernie's grandfather, his paternal grandfather, had supplied the British soldiers with muskets and equipment. 10 years later, their children were to marry. What greater possibility for optimism can you have in a young nation that is at war with itself, that is battling internally, than to present the optimism of a warmonger and a Māori princess? Why have we lost the possibilities that those sort of things have presented to us? I'll take you back to jump forward to the mid-20th century and the effect of the suppression of identity and reo. A prevailing social belief, a misplaced orthodoxy of the time, meant Dad and his siblings and so many others were denied their true identity and birthright. He was far from alone, of course. At the same time, a generation of Māori were being actively disconnected from their reo, the language taonga that underpins what it is to be, what it means to be Māori. The handicap of speaking te reo in a Pākehā world wrenched their identities away. And all humans, consciously or not, crave belonging to something larger than themselves. With the removal of language and culture, they're forced to seek belonging where they could find it. I mentioned the urban drift. It is a natural downstream byproduct of colonialism, and along with the Western belief that the individual is more important than the collective, the results of which we see, the effects of which we see in the rise of gangs. Most acutely and painfully for our society, the rise of gangs, offering a sense of belonging to the most disconnected and disenfranchised. We can do better. Right, this is not my speech, however. I'm going to leave the meat to Sir Joe. I hope you saw his interview on the breakfast program yesterday, because that was probably a better introduction than I could possibly give.